All right. So we're excited to have our second session tonight of the Thrive Prophetic Imagination series called Theologies of Resistance Through the Lens of Acts. If you all were here for my last session with Dr. Milton Keyes, I've been calling it, "Is the church a laundromat?" Even though that wasn't the title. But that was a great question that Dr. Keyes asked in the last session that I think we're still sitting with. And basically, this series is to help to benefit the Thrive cohort, which is about 26 congregations who are focused on racial justice. But it's also just for anyone in the Alliance of Baptists who is committed to the work of justice. Hopefully, this series will help you to be equipped in your work. And tonight, we're going to be talking about Black August. If you're not familiar with Black August, that's okay. That's why we'll get into it. But we'll be talking about Black August, history of revolution, and the political prisoners movement. And we'll be doing that through a conversation with two Black who I will introduce before we get started. If you're just now jumping on, please feel free to put your name, city, and congregation in the chat, just so we know where you're coming from. And thank you everyone who's done it so far. So as I mentioned in our first session, we talked about, is the church a laundromat? Meaning, are there ways that the church, I guess in my words, hinders these acts of resistance rather than supports them? And that is where Dr. Keyes kind of sat, and we talked about that from a theological perspective as well, in the sense of how can we equip ourselves to do that work in our local congregations, but also in our local communities. Some of the resources that we talked about in the first session, I just wanted to share with you all again. This series really came out of the Acts commentary by Willie James Jennings, who I would certainly suggest if you don't have his Acts commentary. It's a really thorough and I think different kind of commentary in the way that he talks about it. That's really helpful. The second book that Milton and I reference is Laundering Black Rage, The Washing of Black Death, People, Property, and Profits. Two Black was on the call with us today, was one of the co-authors, and the other co-author is Rasul A. Mawat. And the last book or resource that we talked about is a book called Plenty Good Room, Co-Creating an Economy of Enough for All, which is written by Andrew Wilkes. We used some of his work in the first session. He talks a lot about not just what it means to be anti-capitalist, but what it means to move towards socialism and his particular experience as a Black Christian socialist and how that can help us to shape our faith communities as well. So I think that will continue to inform us as we go. And then also they are resources that I would suggest along the way as well. So as we get into our conversation tonight, I just wanted to hark back to the 2023 Alliance of Baptists annual gathering. Some of you all may have been there. It was last spring, so last April. And if you all remember, the theme came from the theme of like abolition. So the title was To Set the Captives Free. And the whole thrust of it was like, what is the abolitionist movement? What does it mean for us as people of faith to either be a part of the abolitionist movement or should we be a part of the abolitionist movement? And I think that's something that the Alliance of Baptists was asking itself as well. The subtitle of To Set the Captives Free was Luke 4:18, a theological examination of the criminal legal system and an introduction to the vision of modern abolitionists. So it's basically a gathering where we focus on a theological examination in response to mass incarceration and the carceral system in America, which has more people in prison than any other country in the world. One way that abolitionism was described for the conference was written by Elijah Zayu, which you all may know is one of the co-executive directors of the Alliance of Baptists. And he said the modern abolitionist movement is the continuation of the long struggle to abolish slavery and white supremacy in all their intertwined vestiges. Abolitionists today work towards the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and the reasons they exist by creating lasting alternatives to violent approaches to public safety, punishment, and imprisonment. As you all may remember, some of the guest speakers included Derek Purnell, who wrote Becoming Abolitionist, Police Protests and the Pursuit of Freedom, Reverend Dr. Ben Boswell, who's an Alliance of Baptist pastor at Myers Park. He also wrote Confronting Whiteness, A Spiritual Journey of Reflection, Conversation, and Transformation. And Reverend Dr. Niall Ford was another guest speaker, who's a minister, activist, and scholar, who studies how people resist oppression, build community, and struggle to transform the world. It culminated with a church service at Park Avenue Baptist Church on the anniversary of Tortuguita's death. If you all remember Tortuguita, they were a Stop Cop City activist and forest defender who was shot 57 times by state troopers in the park while really not even while protesting, but just in the park. They were killed by state troopers. Cop City, for those who are not familiar, is being built as an urban warfare facility in Atlanta, Georgia, and that's what Tortuguita was fighting against. So I wanted to ask the question for tonight: where does that leave us now as we discuss abolition and racial justice movements? Particularly in the Thrive cohort, we are discussing what it means to take the next step in moving toward mobilizing and organizing in our communities for justice, in addition to the education component that we have all been a part of, which can include book clubs, documentaries, and even webinars like this one. I will also name that, sorry, let me let someone in from the waiting room. I would also name that as we walk through this tonight, also reflect on the issues that you all are already facing or seeing in your own communities. I know today there have been two Black and I were just talking, at least two toddlers who have been shot today, just in Indianapolis. And honestly, that's really all I'm thinking about right now. Is it's kind of left a heavy heart. So just think about the issues in your own community that you're already facing. And then we have to do something else than what we've been doing. So what is our call to do something else and to perhaps to be more, I think, courageous, and what it means for us to actually take a risk in our communities. And I think that's really what Black August and political prisoners teach us, is that we have to sacrifice and take a risk for something beyond ourselves if we're not satisfied with the way that things are. And if we're thinking about not just issues in terms of issues, but what's breaking your heart right now is also another way to think about it. So Two Black has joined us to discuss the political prisoners movement, Black August, and how they both relate to the abolitionist movement as we build theologies and actions of resistance for the church. So thank you, Two Black, so much for joining us. I am going to read your bio, which you probably don't want me to do, but I'm going to read it. Two Black is a poet, scholar, organizer, and filmmaker who blends critical analysis with biting sarcasm. He has headlined various stages and events, including the historic, can you pronounce the Poets Cafe? How do you pronounce the first?
New Eurekan.
Thank you. New Eurekan Poets Cafe in New York City, Princeton University, and Johannesburg Theater in South Africa. Two Black is the co-author of the book Laundering Black Rage, The Washing of Black Death, People, Property, and Profits. His words have been published in online publications such as Black Agenda Report, Left Voice, Blavity, and Hood Communist. He is currently the host of the Black Myths podcast, a podcast debunking the BS said about Black people, and a leader of the Defense Committee to Free the Pendleton 2. So thank you, Two Black, so much for joining us. All right, so we can go ahead and get into it. As I said, I'm going to try to get this done by around 8 or 8:30, but I'm excited about the conversation. So I will just start with the first question. How would you define a political prisoner in the history of Black August?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. Peace to everybody that's here. I look forward to this discussion. To answer your question, a political prisoner on a base level, there's honestly different definitions of political prisoners, but so I'm going to give the most, I guess, wide umbrella term or catch for it all. So, a political prisoner is someone who is imprisoned for their political beliefs or their political views that are in opposition to the capitalist state or to the existing infrastructure. So, someone who is just in prison because they just believe anything, and that, like someone who's in prison like a Donald Trump, like because we've been trying to flesh this out internally, is not he's not honestly going to prison, but someone who got a charge, some small chance could be sent to prison would not be considered a political prisoner because what Donald Trump, the type of corruption he was involved in is pretty typical of the United States. It's not an opposition to it. So I want to make that distinction. So someone who is in prison for a political activity that is in opposition to the existing order, the existing oppressive order. So that can be someone who is on the outside of prison and is brought up on charges because of something they did political, whether that's violent or nonviolent, and then they can be sent to prison, or you can become politicized in prison. So let's say you went to prison for petty theft, but as we'll talk about with the Pendleton 2, you committed an act that pushed back against, let's say, the racist guards, and they then imprisoned you excessively due to that act. So you can become a political prisoner on simply trumped up charges, as in you did not do the charge whatsoever, or you did not do the crime whatsoever, or you can become a political prisoner due to excessive charges. So let's say you did something, or it's arguable that you did something, but the state will give you the maximum amount because they want to make an example out of you, when most people that did the same crime don't even get a quarter of that, right? They want to make an example out of you because your crime was committed against a particular entity that the state finds vital to their interests, right? So that's how we think about political prisoners more broadly. There's different examples. As one of my elders once told me, we could even consider someone like Martin Luther King a political prisoner. It was short term. He never spent any long-term time in prison. It was in jail when he would get arrested during a protest, but he was being arrested because he defied, the Jim Crow South, right? Because he defied apartheid. So we can think about him, think about long-term political prisoners on the other end of the spectrum, like Mumia Abu-Jamal, who's doing life, but originally got the death penalty for allegedly killing a cop in Philadelphia, despite much evidence proving differently. But it was clear that he got that penalty because the type of work he was doing, anti-police brutality work prior to that as a journalist. So he was already a known entity by the police, and he was regularly targeted by them. So he got the death penalty, and then people had to fight just to get him life, which he's still currently serving life right now. There's many that fit in between that. There's your whistleblowers like a Julian Assange or a Chelsea Manning, people who Julian Assange thankfully just recently got off, but who had been faced persecution, Edward Snowden, those people as well. Then you think about Assad Shakur, and the list goes on. The United States likes to act like it doesn't have political prisoners. They like to, demonize other countries and say that's Cuba, or Russia, or China, or something. And this is not a knock on those countries. I'm just simply saying that's how they like to depict those countries when the United States has plenty. So that's like a baseline definition. Excuse me. As far as Black August, just to give a brief history of that. Um, Black August is fundamentally the month of August to commemorate Black political prisoners and Black radical and revolutionary struggle. It is not a celebration. So that's one thing. So if you see anybody waving around red, black, and green flags and having parties, that's not what this is. They've already misappropriated the day or the month, I should say. It's a commemoration because it's to say we have ongoing struggles. So we want to commemorate those struggles and remember them, a celebration would imply that we've won and that all those struggles have been fixed and they've been worked out, and that's not true. So we have people rotting away in prison. There's really not anything to celebrate. So it started going all the way back to 1970. We're going to talk a little bit about George Jackson, who was a well-known revolutionary and political prisoner out in San Quentin, California. He was in prison in San Quentin for stealing something. It was he got 1 to 99 years for that. Um, this is before he was even a political prisoner. He was simply just as we would call, a social prisoner, or if you're familiar with some works, we call it just a regular captive when we talk about within the colonial context. As he gets to prison, he reads, he gets in contact with other mentors, he becomes politicized, and he becomes like really an international phenomenon. But how he becomes that to some extent is the activity that took place behind prison fighting against the guards. So I'll give a quick run through because again, this history could get a little bit long. But in 1970, there was a assassination of some of his fellow comrades, 21-year-old W.O. Nolan, Cleveland Edwards, who was also 21 years old, and then Alvin Jugs Miller, who was 23 years old. They were assassinated by the guards in San Quentin prison after they had gotten into an altercation with the Aryan Nation. And as they were effectively beating the Aryan Nation up for what they had done, the guards stepped in and shot and killed them. So 4 days later, there was a response to this, and there was a guard who was beaten and thrown over the tier. And although there was no evidence really to justify it, George Jackson, along with Fleta Drumgoole and John Clichette, who were later known as the Soledad brothers, were accused and charged for this retaliation. And that's where you get Soledad brothers, because they were put on this, restraint unit. So if you're familiar with George Jackson, there's a book called Soledad Brother by George Jackson, and it's a series of letters that demonstrates his evolution as a revolutionary. Soledad Brother, The Prison Letters of George Jackson is the name of the book. This connects to what people, we're talking about abolition. It actually connects to Angela Davis. This is not really talked about very often, but Angela Davis eventually joins his defense committee when she learns of this case. And that's, at the time, Angela Davis was not well known. This is actually the case that brings her into the kind of prominence that we know her today. At the time, she was a communist professor who was being persecuted, I believe, at UCLA for that, but was not internationally known or anything of that nature. She then joins the defense committee, actually falls in love with George Jackson. If you read through some of the letters in that book, you can see the indications there. But the bigger issue was not that, it's that the brother of George Jackson, Jonathan Jackson, he took it upon himself, the Marion County Courthouse in California on August 7th, 1970. This is after his brother has been in prison as he's been hit with the retaliation charge. He went into a court with several weapons, including M1 carbine, and he demanded that they free his brother, and he passed guns to several people who were on trial at that time, and they were going to take hostages and try to get his brother out of prison. This is just what happened. They went into a van, and they had the judge in the van. Jonathan did not kill anyone. The cops shot into the van, killed Jonathan, and then killed the judge as well, which was consistent with anyone knows anything about Attica, which happens about a year later in the Attica revolt in New York. The cops led by George Nelson Rockefeller shot into they shot through the guards to kill the prisoners, and they killed guards and prisoners. So the state was showing that even if you take hostages, we will kill everyone. This is consistent with even what Israel did in just recently following October 7th, called the Hannibal Directive, where they actually, it's proven by their own newspapers, shot shot people who were being taken hostage, shot other Israelis who were being taken hostage. So this is the mindset of the state, just to make those connections. So as that occurs, Jonathan Jackson dies, and Angela Davis is actually put on trial for this because these were her guns, and they try to say she had something to do with it, and that's how she becomes the FBI most wanted, and she had to go on the run. And this is how Angela Davis is kind of like blown up to be this icon. Angela Davis eventually beats the case. Rochelle McGee, who was her co-defendant, just got out, but was actually the longest serving political prisoner. Rochelle McGee was again one of the people who the guns was passed to by Jonathan Jackson. He did not know this was going to happen, but he still stood tall. Just want to name those names. The judge's name was Harold Daly, and then there's a deputy DA, Gary Thomas, and a juror by the name of Maria Graham. But again, the cops assassinated effectively all of them by shooting into the van. I don't think everyone died, but that was the goal. So after that happened, there was this. This is when things get even more murky. George Jackson was allegedly said to be trying to escape from prison. I don't find this story very believable. They say he had an afro wig. That he said that his lawyer snuck in an afro wig. This is the official police story, and he tried to hide a gun in his afro. Again, this is a man who read. You read any of his works, he's a very intelligent person, so it's really hard to believe this story. And then he was assassinated in August. I can't remember the exact date, but he was assassinated in August as well. So this is actually, if you're familiar with the Attica Revolt, I won't get into that too. They said that George Jackson is who inspired them. So again, we don't want to think about George Jackson as just an individual, but someone who inspired them to take over the prison in Attica, New York, in 1971, I believe. And that started in September, but there was other revolts in like the Tombs Rebellion and things of that nature in August. So that's why they still commemorate all these things within August. So as that happened, again, George Jackson was also considered a field marshal of the Black Panther Party. He was given that title by Huey P. Newton. He is an inspiration to this day across all prisons when you're talking about any kind of revolutionary struggle. And he really makes he wasn't just some brute. He was a true political scientist. Like if you read his work, he's very in depth, very well studied. Had a very realist view about how to deal with the United States. And even though everybody may not agree, he presented us with an analysis of the United States that forced us to have to grapple, particularly as Black people, with our position in the United States. So in 1978, one of his comrades is actually killed, Gatari Gaulden, through just what's called medical neglect. He got hurt in a football field. The guards just didn't see to him. They just let him die on the field. That was the last straw. And then a year later, outside the walls of San Quentin, various people from the prison and outside the prison met together to found what we call Black August, and that was in 1979. And it's also important to know Black August, it's the last point on this, has second to last point is a good month to honor these things. Nat Turner's rebellion was in Black August, or was in August. The Watts riot was in August. The March on Washington was in August. The Haitian Revolution was in August. What else? Marcus Garvey, his birthday is in August. James Baldwin's birthday is in August, and so on and so forth. There's more, but so this is a month that we don't just uplift them, but we are taught to study, train, and fast. So some people fast, and there's different days that people will fast in honor of these comrades who have died. You're taught to study, and then obviously organize, because George Jackson always talked about being at war and being prepared and trained to go to war. So that's generally the layout of it all. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I appreciate that. Um, you talk about how political prisoners are fighting against the state. That's a specific marker of what makes someone a political prisoner. Can you define what the state is and what you mean when you say that? And then can you also talk about Can you talk about the sacrifices that political prisoners are making and the collective organizing that gets done for a larger struggle? Because people may hear this and just think like they're only fighting for what's happening like behind prison walls. But can you talk about how that's connected to all of us, even those of us who are not in prison?
Hmm. Yeah, so the state can be defined, again, similar to political prisoners, there's different definitions of the state. The definition I use, and the one I use in my own book, comes from my co-author, Rasul Mawat, but he pulls on authors like and thinkers like Antonio Gramsci, even Marx, Stuart Hall, and he wrote the configuration of the power of government, corporate interests, classes of elites, upper levels of bureaucratic management class implements the ruling class's goals and aims to sit atop an accumulated economic base. So that might just sound like jargon, but effectively, sometimes people will say, a lot of people will say the government is the state government, the state is the government, and I get that, but his argument is that there is a ruling class under capitalism that keeps things, that wants to maintain their interests and keep control over society and keep them like in motion to serve those interests. And you can't reduce that to the government, especially in today's situation. I don't even think that makes sense. So he's saying whether it's corporate interests, government, bureaucratic aspects, all those things that sit upon, as he talked about, an economic accumulated base, are geared in a way to serve the interests of the capitalists, of the ruling class. And prisons, if we're gonna, since that's what we're here to talk about today, are just one instrument of doing that. So prisons are a way to, particularly in this mass incarceration era that we're in, are a way to, keep what we call surplus populations, in like managed, again, layman terms, as people that there's really no jobs for, there's really no opportunities for, there's really not there's nothing that the state or the overall like country can offer those people. So they're usually they're in the black market. They might be committing crimes, against crimes that are politically kind of made up by the state. But so these are people who, there's not really a task for them. So prisons became a social solution to that social problem. And if you read Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Golden Gulag, this pretty much that lays out that argument without going deep into it. But prisons are also a means of keeping the more rebellious people in the population and the more revolutionary minded folks. It becomes a center to fix all those problems. So it's a means of fixing poverty, and from the perspective of the state, I'm saying, not for me. It's a means of fixing, the more rebellious people. It's a means of giving certain folks jobs so they buy into it. And what is not, and a lot of times people get this confused, is a means of profit. Prisons actually run at a loss, which I think is worse because the state is saying that we're willing to spend more money than we make simply to keep people under control. Private prisons make up a very small 7-8% of most prisons. Most prisons are government funded and operate at a loss. So profit is not the direct motivation of prisons, but for capitalists, it's a motivation because it stabilizes markets, because you just have all these people that capitalists have said we have nothing for. We don't want to pay taxes in that sense. We don't want to pay for social welfare nets. We don't want to pay for social democracy. We don't want to pay for these people anymore other than through prison. So we'll send our money for that. And then, there's rises of crime and you create these boogeymans and people all kind of buy into, let's lock them all up, right? And that's how we end up with that. So political prisoners come actually with the era we're talking about with the Black August, that comes before the complete rise of mass incarceration, or it comes, I just say it really at the beginning of it. Like, the war on drugs is launched in the late 60s. And it becomes this, or law and order. Law on drugs actually launched in the 70s, but the law and order with Nixon, and really even before that, you could go to Lyndon B. Johnson and look at his war on crime. And you can see this comes out of this counterinsurgency that was done in other countries. And it's now about how do we stay ahead of this rebellious population that we think we need to be able to control. So prison expansion becomes, on one side, if you read Tip of the Spear or Simon Burton's work about how can we build more prisons? And they're saying on one side, we're trying to fix the issue of prisons because one of the major issues of prisons is like overpopulation, overcrowding, lack of sanitary, environment. So we're going to build more prisons. That was one of the logics of it. But then you have to find a way to fill these prisons. So like something Ruthie Wilson Gilmore talks about is how laws were literally changed to give people more time so they could go to these prisons. Like things that were not really as considered as big of a deal got more time so you could fill these prisons. Right. So that's the general logic. So political prisoners are not simply just struggling against the conditions that they have to experience inside. Their argument is always that this is reflective of the broader society. And some of them will even say we're all in a version of prison. They'll just say those of us on the outside are in a minimum security prison because that's their view of the state. And then they're just in a higher security prison. So they're trying to heighten those contradictions to show that the prison is not just something where you just cast people off in a corner somewhere because they're all the bad guys, so we can all do work and be happy over here. No, prisons are an extension of repression that you will even get with the police, and it's a way of capital to keep things in their interests. And there needs to be an ugly side to that, like a prison, and then there needs to be a lighter side, a softer power, like buying people off, like bribing people, like giving people nice jobs so they can feel like they belong in society. You need the carrot and the stick.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And that reminds me of a conversation I had with someone who grew up in a rural area in Indiana, and she was saying how people in her community would fight to have the prison like down the street because they wanted those jobs. So a lot of people may say like we don't want prison. She was like our community often fought like please bring a prison here, right? Because they're thinking about employment. So thank you for
It's
naming
important.
that. And
It's important to
oh, go
note
ahead.
real quick on that point that when prisons come to cities, you tend to see a rise of domestic violence. You tend to see a rise in alcoholism. You might even see a rise in just general violence because the people working in these places don't come home very happy.
Mm,
And even that again is a way the capital is able to say, okay, we don't have jobs that people are going to lock up. We're going to give you minimal jobs so you can manage it. And that's when we say the prison industrial complex. Again, these terms just can kind of thrown around, but what that means is there is a bought in interest for everyone to be committed to this as a solution and this as the project. So there is capitalists who are like, okay, we can get rid of labor forces that we don't need anymore. And then there's poor cities that don't have jobs. You can get bought into it. There's land speculators who couldn't really sell their land for much, so they had but they'll take the money that comes from prisons and the investment. There's people that don't want to pay taxes, but they're willing to at least
mm,
pay tax money for prisons, and so it became a solution that fit with different interests actually, and became a kind of centralized solution. So whether it's people in those cities, and any people who thought crime was a problem, it was a way to get rid of those folks supposedly.
mm. No, that's helpful. And that reminds me of something else. Also, I would say if you all have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A at the end if you all have any questions, but if anything's coming up for you now, you can feel free to ask as well. That point reminds me of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's concept of organized abandonment. Can you
Mhm.
talk more about that and how that relates to, yeah, just what we're talking about as it relates to prisons and communities at large?
Well, yeah, she talks about, if I remember correctly, she talks about like the way that people will say like market forces and and they just had like market forces. It implies sometimes that there wasn't an individual making a choice, that it's just kind of this, as you hear, the unseen hand or whatever. And she's like, no, organized abandonment is to say we're going to divest from an area, and that is a policy decision. That is a decision made by the state, but again, not the state as some boogeyman, but people in office, people who have their own interests. Because another part I didn't talk about are politicians in this prison industrial complex. So you have politicians who are trying to appeal to a base that's been gassed up about crime by the media or something. And the way for them to solve it is, hey, let's be tough on crime or whatever. But what you end up with is you divest the resources that would be needed so a community can actually take care of themselves and not turn to those kind of things. And I always say this, there's this myth people say, poverty creates crime. Well, I push back on that because again, crime's happening all the time. The United States is founded on crime. Like that's not really crime happens everywhere. So crime's happening in all the rich neighborhoods, crime, quote unquote crime, whatever, that happens everywhere. So it's not that poverty creates crime, it's that poverty is criminalized. Like I said earlier, laws were changed to put more people in prison, to send them to prison longer, right? Like this is proven, particularly in California. So the point of organized abandonment is like we have this, we organize the abandonment of a particular area and a particular type of people, usually a stigmatized population like Black people, and we're going to take resources from here and we're going to put them somewhere else. And that is a strategic, purposeful, conscious choice. That is not a market that just kind of does it out of some kind of, subversive thing. Like it happens on purpose. So you can see when we talked earlier about when you talked about a child getting killed or something, like that's a product of organized abandonment. That is a baby getting killed. When you ride through a neighborhood and you see a bunch of vacant homes and you see you see people just barely making it, that is a product of organized abandonment. That's not an accident. That didn't just happen because the people there have poor morals or something. That is a policy choice.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And unfortunately, this series of children being killed in Indianapolis is reminding me of my time in St. Louis. And I remember there was one summer where there were so many people being killed, but really just children being killed. And I remember it was mostly happening like in North City or South City where I lived, some of the more economically depressed areas of the city. And then I had to preach, and I think it was like South County. And South County is a pretty well off area of St. Louis. Um, and I really preached. It was called a eulogy for Xavier, which was a young second grader who had just been murdered. And I just I named all the children that had been murdered and kind of named like this wasn't happening in the neighborhood that I was preaching in, right? Like this is not something that would probably happen in South County, but it was happening in North City and South City and North County and stuff like that. And I remember that outrage wasn't about because my friend was the pastor who invited me to preach. I remember him telling me that his congregants weren't upset that the children were being, they didn't really mention the children being murdered. They were upset that I said the names in the service.
Mm.
And so just a sense of just living, I think, in the organized abandonment in St. Louis in the ways that those communities were affected by that organized abandonment, which is so intentional, which I appreciate you naming that. Like organized abandonment is organized, like it's intentional. That's something that's on purpose. It's not something that just kind of falls out of the sky. Okay, so I want to bring it back to kind of like abolition, like we talked about before. As I mentioned, the Alliance of Baptists has focused on the present day abolitionist movement. How does the political prisoner movement in the history of Black August relate to the current movement for abolition? And I'm also trying to keep track of some of the resources to drop those in the chat as well. So you can go ahead.
How does the political prisoner movement? This one when I read, I was pondering. I didn't. This is one of the few questions I didn't even have any notes on. So this is just going to be kind of off the top of my head. But
That's fine.
but yeah, I think sometimes I don't know if there's much of a relationship, to be honest with you. If I'm being totally honest, I think
that was going to be my second question.
yeah. But I think that abolition has become a concept for people, and that's fine. That serves its own means to some extent. But I think because people have a certain aversion to violence, and people who were willing to get violent, whether they agree with violence or not. There's just an aversion to really talking about violence. So George Jackson is not really somebody that typically comes up at least in a lot of the abolition conversations I've been in, or really the fact that the point of what George Jackson and many of those not just political prisoners, but many of the revolutionaries during that time who were being sent to prison were, um, like if you read the book I referenced earlier, The Tip of the Spear, like Ori talks about how during that time, like people wanted to go into prison because not because of this myth that people want to go there to get a plate or something, or people wanted to get to prison because they wanted to be part of the movement. They wanted to be part of
Mm,
because the goal was to destroy the prison from within, to totally
mm,
subvert the place from within, to abolish the prison from within through whatever means necessary to do that. It wasn't to just imagine a new world. So it's important to know that prison abolition comes from people intellectualizing about prison and about what it meant, and the revolutionaries seeing prison as a type of war waged
mm,
by the state against them, and not just against the revolutionaries, but they saw that all Black African people were, a means of it was a way of waging war against them since being captives of slavery. And this is an extension of that. So, the point was to abolish the prison from within. Like, I was talking to Christopher Knight Trotter. This was a little bit later. This was in the 80s and 90s, but they were talking about how they were on a what was called the MCC, the maximum control complex, I believe, in Westville, Indiana, Westville prison. And he was like, our point was to eliminate, when we went on hunger strike, we didn't just want to have some demands met. We wanted to eliminate that MCC. We wanted to get rid of the Supermax prison. We only
mm,
conceded other things when we realized we could not do that, but that was our point. We wanted to get rid of the entire thing,
mm,
because they were realizing that this was not reforming or rehabilitating anyone, and they thought that the prisons needed to be removed for that reason. So their conception of abolition was a lot different than maybe you might hear from certain academics who, I'm not saying don't mean well. I'm just saying sometimes they don't really deal with that reality. The fact that one of the most popular abolitionist Angela Davis, and this is not a knock on her, I'm just talking about the way we conceive of it. We don't really even know that her connections to a George Jackson, that she was on his defense committee. That's not really that's
mm,
a very vague footnote, if anything, when we're all talking about it. So they had a particular vision of it, and then they needed the help from people on the outside to, ultimately lead to that goal. So they wanted to abolish prison by organizing inside prison, by doing their own form of rehabilitation inside prison for each other, not waiting on the state to do it, and then by sending those people home to an extent where they would not have to come back to prison. So it wasn't all just like let's burn it down or whatever. It was also, there was a certain moral integrity that when I've spoken to some of them, that they had. When they did send people out, it was to still stay in the movement, and if they came in, it was to help subvert the prison itself. So I don't know how much that's tied to the modern abolition conversation. I think it varies depending on where you go. But their concept of it wasn't just, a kind of budgetary redistribution of resources kind of thing. It was a bit more than that. It was a kind of entire sense of being, not just getting rid of the physical prison, but even they talk about the colonial mentality and eliminating that within you. And that was a way of abolishing the prison too. Was abolishing that kind of criminal mentality that you had been given by the state, was also getting rid of that too. Like that's how they conceived of it.
yeah, that's really powerful, like abolishing the carceral mindset and the idea that folks were like, I want to go to prison to be a part of a larger movement to abolish the prison from the inside. I think that is not something we hear a lot when we talk about the modern abolitionist movement. So um, that's a helpful reframing. Before I ask you a follow-up question about that in the ways that maybe the modern abolitionist movement has been laundered, can you talk to us about what is Black rage? And can you explain your concept that you lay out very well in your book, Laundering Black Rage? Can you define laundering Black rage as so?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to truncate this for the sake of time because that's a whole session. But so on a baseline, when we're talking about we'll come back. We're going to talk about Black rage. We'll come back to it quickly. But Black rage is as we understand it, is a response to oppression. We're talking about a collective response. We're not just simply talking about a feeling here. That's not how we define it. We're talking about a collective response. But also from the perspective of the state, it is this boogeyman that is always kind of waiting around that they don't really know when it's going to pop up. And that's why there's this tendency to see Black people as inherently angry or whatever, because there's a sense that all this injustice that's done to us, we will one day respond in a way that is not kind, right? So it works on both ends, whether it's how we see it or how the state sees it. Laundering, on a real basic level, that's where I have to really truncate the messaging. It's taking something on a basic level, laundering, how we all understand it within the broader sense, is taking something that appears dirty and making it appear clean, like it is on a very basic level. So if someone is a drug dealer, if you watch any shows like Ozarks or Breaking Bad or whatever, you're trying to take the money that you make through illicit means, such as, like I said, meth or something, try and take that money and make it appear clean so you can now withdraw it from your bank and there's no red flags or anything. So there's a process of conversion that has to take place to do that. You can't just obviously take the drug money and just throw it in the bank. That'll get flagged. Like there's actually a rule: if you deposit more than $10,000, you literally get flagged. Like that's a federal law. So you have to figure out how you can, get that money into the system. So you set up fronts, and there's a process of doing that. You set up other means that you can clean your money. But again, it never really is cleaned. You're just making it appear clean because you're mixing it with other means of cash. So that's like the general way. And eventually there's three phases to that. There's placement, layering, and integration. I won't get into all that for the sake of time. But once it comes out, it appears clean. But so we don't, me and my co-author, we don't
And one
object.
of the fronts, sorry, I was gonna say, so one of the fronts could be like a car wash or something, right? Like you have the money and then you put
Mm,
up a front as a car wash, and then that cleans your money. So then now you can,
yeah, a
so
car
that's an
wash.
example of like a front.
Yeah, a car wash, a laundromat. I always tell this funny story. When I was in South Africa, they didn't have good Wi-Fi, so there would be these Wi-Fi cafes, but they were just half the time their Wi-Fi didn't work either. The point was they were really doing something else. But but the Wi-Fi cafe was a way to bring in cash because people would pay to use Wi-Fi because Wi-Fi wasn't as easily accessible when I was in South Africa. So yeah, you have these fronts, and these fronts are really what does the conversion of the money from, quote unquote dirty to making it appear clean. Um, but so our position is that a definition is fine. We don't really have a different definition. We just think it should be applied much more broadly than just your kind of common criminal that you're watching a TV show, or the gangsters or something like that. So our point is just like, if you think about the founding of the United States, for instance, you have it was originally Turtle Island. Um, you bring settlers here, you bring colonialists here, you take the land, you build on top of the land, you build businesses, you build government, and you have a constitution, and now you call it the United States. Um, you laundered your conquest. That's all that is. You stole, you robbed, and then you created these fronts that can justify and legitimize the conquest as something different. That is something different as a country, as something different as whatever the business that supports it as a general. So the states, like we talked about earlier, becomes the first front. So Black Rage, coming back to that, is something that has to be converted as well, because it's Black Rage in its purest form can actually threaten the existing order of things, because you've oppressed people, you've brutalized them, and the maintenance to keep this front going, to keep this conquest perpetuating, is going to obviously anger some people very deeply. So they're going to respond. And we studied Black Rage, so Black people will respond. And yes, we'll get to a few examples I put down, but that Black people have responded. So the state has to engage in a management system of how do we take this rage and convert it to serve our interests, and not so much the interests of the people who are responding to their oppression. All right, so that's a very simple explanation of laundering Black rage. So the book is about trying to understand that conversion, that process.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And I had this phrase as a question, but I'm going to say it as a statement and then get back to it at the end. But I think there are ways that the modern day abolitionist movement has been laundered, to your point earlier, that's taken us away from the roots of what prison abolition meant. And I think at the end, maybe we can talk about ways to get back to the roots of what prison, abolition is and that movement and how we can support it. Before we get to that, though, because this is a theological series focused on the church, and Dr. Keys there asked the question about whether the church is a laundromat. Is the church a front, or is the church hindering what we could say is, like, for example, the prison abolition movement or revolutionary action that has taken place? So historically and in the present day, how has the capital C church both hindered and played a role in supporting revolutionary action that confronts the state? That will probably have to be a truncated answer too, but if you could just think about some ways that the church has both hindered and played a role in supporting that revolutionary action.
Yeah, I think I don't know who first came up with the phrase. When those Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture, used to say, when Christianity came to Africa, we had the land and they had the Bible. When they left, they had the land and we had the Bible. So so there's ways that missionaries come in and convert. Once there's a military conquest, you also need a cultural and social conquest, right? To put people on the same page with the culture of the oppressor. If people are still praying to their gods and to their way of life, that is not always going to work hand in hand with what you have going on, because they might have a totally different logic that is probably more liberating than the kind of colonial Christianity that you're pushing on them. So that's from the foundation. Since we're talking about conquest, there was a religious rationalization to it. There's boats named after Jesus. There's like slave ships named after Jesus. There's stories of the first two slaves getting on the boat being called Adam and Eve. So there's various ways we could go down that road. To name a few more specific examples, because I think we're all pretty I'm going to guess, have some sense of how church and slavery went hand in hand, or church and colonialism went hand in hand, and converted populations over to those religions. That's not to say that people should cast out Christianity or Catholicism or anything like that, but it's just to say that that was a role in the colonial process. There's no denying that. That's pretty well documented throughout the world. But some more, I guess, a few more examples. There was an example I just learned about this not too long ago. I had to do a presentation on the Cuban Revolution, and after the Cubans won in 1959, after they overthrew Batista, there was a operation called Operation Peter Pan, and it was a campaign of disinformation and scaremongering done by the CIA from a station in Honduras, Radio Swan. And the central message was that Cuba's new and ambitious education drive, an attempt to create a modern egalitarian system on the island, was in fact an insidious plot by which the revolutionary government would steal children from the care of their parents and maybe even ship them to Russia. So the United States funded a program that fear-mongered about these egalitarian programs, these socialist programs. And honestly, at the time, Cuba wasn't even calling itself socialist, so that came later. But these programs that were scary and they were going to take away, and they made it seem like the actual goal was to take away your children. You still hear stuff like this sometimes with some of these right-wing conspiracies. They have a tinge of that too. This was a CIA thing. Like the CIA funded what was called Radio Swan to fearmonger. But so one of the main entities that helped transport children for parents who were scared and actually bought into this propaganda was the Catholic Church. They were the ones that would, help transport children from Cuba to Florida or somewhere else, because there was this fear mongering among certain people in the community that if their children went to the schools, if their children stayed in this government, that they would actually, be taken away. So they exploited people's feelings very real way. And the CIA did that. And they often targeted the lower class children within the Cuban society, because the rich people left anyway, because their money and their land that they had already stolen from people was being appropriated, so they already ran away. But the some of the lower class kids who were more likely to support the revolution, this is where that propaganda was used to target, right? So that's a more modern example. Another even more modern example is at Mother Emanuel AME Church. These are I'll give you the good, about to get to the good, but a Mother Emanuel AME Church, they brought Joe Biden. This is a very simple one, to speak, while he was committing a genocide. I don't really need to lay that out. So they brought him to speak, and this is a church that, just, what was it, in 2015, that Dylan Roof had slain, several Black congregants at Bible study. And they brought Joe Biden there to speak and didn't even bat an eye. And I'm using them as an example, but that's really consistent with a lot of churches that bring politicians on stage who've done horrible things or who will do horrible things, and they regularly are helping launder their kind of propaganda to the population because they know churches are good bases for voters, so that they consistently will put them on, and the pastor may get some kind of kickback or something. I don't know, and that's the process. But it's also important to note that a Mother Emanuel, on a positive end, was the home of Denmark Vesey. And Denmark Vesey it was a failed rebellion because it was a snitch, but he was going to lead a slave rebellion in 1822. Him and Pierre Poyos, they were going to kill the colonists. They were going to light buildings on fire, and they were going to escape on a boat to Cuba, or not Cuba, to Haiti, excuse me. They were going to escape on a boat to Haiti. And because the Haitian Revolution had just happened, and it just been completed 18 years prior. It had just started from 1971 or 1791 to 1804. So they were going to head to Cuba, or head to Haiti. I keep saying Cuba, head to Haiti. And only reason he was able to almost do this was because it was the church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, that actually assisted him in plotting this revolt, right? Churches were, essential in some cases of either helping plot revolts back then, or at the very least, we're talking about the Underground Railroad or something, helping transport people from slavery to the North to have some version of freedom. It's also important to note Nat Turner rebellion. Nat Turner was a minister. Nat Turner had visions. Nat Turner did not just wake up one day. Nat Turner believed that this was the will of God to do this. Now, people can argue that all they want. I'm not here to, get into that, but these are what I would consider, ways in which the church is helpful in terms of either supporting people's visions for change or materially assisting them for change. So I don't think you see that as much today. But I think, even when we look at the civil rights movement, not all Black churches, but certain Black churches were fundamental in giving meeting spaces and, strategizing and providing even resources, for that struggle. So, there are good and bad ways, but I think the church is generally used as a kind of colonial entity and a conquering entity, and that's something that constantly has to be fought against. I don't think it's as important, or the church is as essential, I should say, in today's, kind of context as it maybe once was when it received all the money. It doesn't get as much money as it used to because there are just other outlets. But I think those are just some examples, I think, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. I know we're coming up on an hour, so I want to be mindful of that. And in case folks have to jump off, I do want to talk about the Pendleton 2, who they are, and how people can support and get involved. For those on the call, I will say we'll go over because we're recording this, and we do want to use this as kind of a learning webinar. So if you're able to stay on, please do. If not, this will be recorded and shared later, but we would love for you to stay on, especially if you have any questions or anything you might want to ask. So you currently help to lead the Defense Committee to free the Pendleton 2, and myself and Dr. Keys are also a member of that committee, which supports 2 political prisoners here in Indiana. Can you tell us more about the Pendleton 2? And you can take your time sharing the story. And then can you share how we can support the campaign to get them free?
Yeah, the Pendleton 2, again, another thing that I won't be able to tell as long, because I could go on for another half an hour about just that. But the Pendleton two, I guess the overall way of explaining it were two political prisoners by the name of John Balagoon Gold and Christopher Knight Trotter, who on February 1st, 1985, came to the rescue of a prisoner and friend by the name of Lincoln Love, who was being beaten by the racist guards. He was his name was Lincoln Love, and he was a jailhouse lawyer and comrade and someone who had helped to get many people out of prison at the time. And he was being beaten by these guards nearly to death. And then it was once that beating began, there was a word was sent to Balagoon, who was one of the Pendleton two, and he went to check on him. He couldn't get through to see what was going on, so he went back to population and talked to the broader group of men who they were involved with, which was part of a prison group called the Black Dragons, which I just recently learned was actually an offshoot of the Black Guerrilla Family, which was George Jackson's organization. So just to show a little bit of lineage there. They once they brought a pack of prisoners to go see what was happening to Lincoln Love, because he had been dragged out of the tier by his head, and they were continuing to well on him. Once they asked to know what was going on, the guards denied them. They asked peacefully originally, the guards attacked them. They fought back, and then a melee broke out. All the prison guards were coming. There was a transcript by a prisoner, or excuse me, by a prison guard, where he said he heard the guards say the job was to kill the son of a bee in terms of Lincoln Love, so they were going to kill him. As this melee broke out, they're being chased. Primarily, Cole and Trotter are being chased around the prison. They go to the infirmary, still trying to look for their friend Lincoln Love to save him. They can't get to him. They get corralled in the infirmary. They are forced to have to fight those guards off. No one died, but they did take several hostages because the guards were trying to kill them. They go into a cell house. They take over about 15 hours. The hostages that they took, they protected them. They did not try to kill them. They actually saved them from anyone trying to kill them. So no one died in this incident. It's perfect. It's important to know that. Yet when they went to trial, it was, there was an all-white jury. They did not really, the evidence was not heard that would defend their side. And, they received 200 plus years in prison. Despite there being evidence that the guards were actually part of a Ku Klux Klan gang named, or unit named the Sons of Lights. So again, there were guards in the KKK. This was confessed to by a guard who worked there by the name of Michael Richardson. It's a public deposition that we have in our possession. These were guards, were captains, sergeants all throughout the prison. So despite them, again, no one dying, they got 200 plus years. Naeem only had 3 years left on his sentence, 3 months left on his sentence. Balagoon only had 3 years left on his sentence, so they did not have to make the sacrifice. And they're still locked up to this day. Naeem spent 20 years in solitary confinement. Balagoon spent 32 years in solitary confinement. Thankfully, they're at least back in population. And, again, they're still locked up. They're in their mid-60s. And again, prison ages people faster. So mid-60s is it's not the same as what mid-60s might be for somebody out here who has decent health care and access to gyms and stuff. That's not the situation they're dealing with. So you're talking about people who really have the bodies of nearly 80-year-olds probably. I remember reading a stat that prison, if you crunch the numbers, prison actually adds more years to your life, just based on health. So yeah, we're currently working, as you said, on it with the defense committee to try to get them out. We're trying to raise money for their defense fund so we can take care of the lawyers, because that's essential to this. So we asked for assistance on that part. And then we've made a documentary about them to spread the word on that. We just got done doing a Black August week, connecting them to Black August, week of events, I should say. So we did fundraising with the book talk. We did a rally. We did a film screening at a film festival. We did an art event, and we also did letter writing too. So that's a quick synopsis just to keep time sensitive here, but I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And thank you, Tony, for putting the website in the chat. Here are the hopefully those links come up. Here are the links. Well, they kind of came up. The links that are on this slide. As Subak mentioned, there is a documentary that you can watch that'll give you a fuller story about the case. The website, you can follow the Instagram for events. If you can give money, the Patreon and the fundraising link is there. And also, if you know of any legal support, that would be helpful. We have done documentaries and like talkbacks at churches and congregations trying to organize here in Indianapolis. But if your church or congregation is, also interested or want the co-directors to Black is one of the directors to come and speak, you can let us know as well. But yeah, the links are in the chat. We would appreciate any support, especially as we talk about the abolition movement and political prisoners. It's not just something that's in the past. It's something that's happening right now as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. I will ask if there are any questions that you all might have. As I mentioned, you can feel free to throw them in the chat or come off mute at any time. While I'm waiting for any questions that you all might have that you want to put in the chat, I'll ask you my last question to Black. If you had a call to action for churches, pastors, and congregations or people of faith, what would it be?
Um, I think I don't know. There's a million ways we can go with this. I think theologically, I think people on one hand need to examine their theologies, and this doesn't really take long. So if your theology does not if your theology doesn't address anything that's been stated today, then you probably need a new one or you need to update it. I don't really know any other way of putting it. So that's why I say it doesn't really take long. If your theology is concerned with the after of life and not the current one, then you probably need to get rid of it. I mean, just seriously, like, if it doesn't
Yes,
address
man's in the crowd too.
if it doesn't
See you,
address them,
Elena.
yeah. If it doesn't address the material conditions of people under their current conditions, then I don't think it really has much usage, and you should not be involved in this work if you care about these things, or something has to go, either you or the theology, So I think in terms of more material benefits, I think there are, and I know I understand every church is not rich. That's a myth. But I think that there's money that goes out, in terms of trying to help these things. And again, because I was talking about earlier, because there's an aversion to this kind of content, people who might have engaged in some kind of violence, or people who engage in self-defense, or people who are not simply just trying to integrate into the system, but may have a different view. Those resources rarely reach those entities. And I understand there are reasons why, because those entities are obviously deeply repressed, so you're going to have to face a certain kind of pushback. But I believe we can't really uphold these like sacrifices and champion them that these political prisoners make and be so saddened by it if we're not willing to support them. If you may not be willing to do what Naeem and Balagoon did, or what George Jackson did, or anyone else I've named today, that may not be as far as you're willing to go, and that is what it is. Everybody's not, but that doesn't mean you have to bash those people or cut them off. You can still support those causes. You can still support those people in ways that you feel comfortable doing. That doesn't require you to, as we say sometimes, punch left, or disregard those folks. So I think, if there's any call to action, it's just like find those causes, because there are many political prisoners from the eras that we've named that are rotting away, and they're not receiving a lot of substantial support. They're not able to find upstanding lawyers. They're not able to do that. Pendleton too, even if you think what they did was wrong, there's no reason they should be in there for 40 years for something where no one died. It doesn't make any sense. There's definitely no reason they should have a life sentence for it. But often people are not searching out these causes. So if you're doing your DEI stuff, you're looking to support, marginalized communities or whatever nonprofit language people are using, these people in prison are also that too, and they don't just need to be reformed morally by whatever doctrine people are pushing. They actually need to be gotten out of prison, not simply just given the word so they can pray their way out of the cell. They actually need to be
Mm-hmm.
released physically.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that would be my call to action.
Perfect. Thank you. Are there any questions that anyone wants to ask? You can either come off mute or put it in the chat. If not, thank you so much to Black for joining us tonight. This was extremely informative and helpful, and I hope it was for you all as well. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you all have a good night. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.